Hey there, deep diver. Have you ever thought about like all the hidden stories behind, like the big names in philosophy?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's kind of what we're looking at today.
Okay.
We are diving deep into 18th century German philosophy, but no Kant this time around.
Okay.
You shared some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on pre-Kantian thought, and honestly, it is packed with ideas we just got to explore.
Yeah, it's really easy to think of this period as like the warm-up act for Kant.
Right.
But honestly, that just doesn't do justice to the intellectual energy, happening all over the German-speaking world.
Yeah.
You have these different schools of thought, practical concerns, even people pushing back against, the accepted ideas of the time. It's a much more interesting picture than most people realize.
Okay, so our main source is this super in-depth article from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yep.
And it really makes you rethink 18th century German thought. One thing that jumps out is how many of these thinkers weren't, just academics stuck in their ivory towers.
Yeah.
Like Christian Thomasius, for example. What makes him so different?
Thomasius was really into practical philosophy.
Okay.
He really believed that philosophy should actually improve daily life,
Right.
not just be some sort of abstract theory,
Yeah.
And get this, he wrote in German
Oh, wow.
instead of the usual scholarly Latin. He really wanted to reach a wider audience.
Right.
And at a time when academic tradition was everything, that was a pretty radical move.
It's almost like he was like the original public intellectual.
Kind of, yeah.
But it wasn't just about making philosophy easier to understand, right?
Right.
His ideas were actually pretty revolutionary,
Oh,
too.
absolutely.
Like, in what way?
So he was super skeptical of authority of any kind, whether it was religious dogma or these rigid academic structures. He was all about independent thinking, which was, a huge part of the Enlightenment.
Right, yeah.
But what I find really fascinating is his theory of truth. He basically takes the classic correspondence theory and kind of flips it on its head.
Okay, hold on. Remind me, what is the correspondence theory again? I feel like we're going full philosophy nerd here.
Yeah. So it's the idea that our beliefs are true if they sort of match up with reality.
Okay.
Like if you imagine a map matching the actual terrain.
Right.
Right?
Okay.
But Thomasius argues the opposite. He says things need to agree with our minds,
Huh.
not just the other way around.
Okay.
And this isn't just like playing with words. It has really big implications for how we know anything at all.
So it's not just about observing the world passively.
Right.
Our minds actually shape how we understand truth.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a big shift.
Yeah, and it actually anticipates all these later debates about the role of the subject in knowledge. Like, is truth something objective out there? Or is it somehow constructed by our minds? Thomasius was already asking these questions way before Kant and the idealists.
Wow. Okay, so we've got Thomasius kind of shaking things up within academia.
Right.
But then there's this whole other movement outside the universities, kind of like an underground scene.
Yeah.
Tell me about radical philosophy.
This group was not afraid to push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable.
Okay.
So you have thinkers like Stosch and Lau. They were directly challenging religious authority. They questioned the validity of the Bible, even the idea that the soul is immortal. Really explosive stuff in the 18th century. We're talking high-stakes debates that often got people in trouble with the authorities.
It really makes you appreciate the intellectual freedom that we have today.
Yeah.
Like, it's easy to forget that just expressing those ideas back then could have serious consequences.
Oh, for sure. And their radicalism went beyond just religion.
Okay.
It even touched on how they saw reality itself.
Okay.
They really embraced this idea of materialism.
Materialism.
Yeah, this idea that everything, even the mind or soul, is ultimately just made up of matter. And that went directly against the religious and philosophical views of the time.
Right.
Which usually said that there's this separate immaterial realm,
So on the one hand, you've got Thomasius working within the system, right?
Yeah.
Trying to push the boundaries from within. But then you have these radical thinkers operating almost like philosophical rebels.
Right, yeah.
It's a fascinating contrast.
It really shows you how diverse intellectual life was at the time.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just limited to these two camps either.
Right.
In the more official philosophical world, you have Christian Wolff.
Okay.
Who was systematically building on Leibniz's ideas.
Okay.
And he was spreading them across German universities. But even he had his critics.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
The clash between Wolff and the Pietists, that was a huge turning point for 18th century German philosophy.
All right, let's get into that. Christian Wolff. He's the big name that always comes up when you read about this period.
Right.
So who was he, and what were his main ideas?
Okay, so Wolff's philosophy, which a lot of people call like Nietzschean Wolffian philosophy.
Catchy.
Yeah, I know, right?
Okay.
It was hugely influential. He basically took Leibniz's work and made it a system, made it more accessible to a broader audience.
Okay.
One of his big contributions was this idea that you could use a mathematical approach to philosophy.
A mathematical approach.
Yeah, he believed we could apply rigorous, logical reasoning, almost like using equations to metaphysics and even ethics.
Wow, that's ambitious.
It was.
Trying to capture the complexity of being human using math.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, like, how well can that actually work?
Yeah, it was definitely bold, super innovative. One of the core principles he took from Leibniz was something called the principle of sufficient reason.
Okay.
And this basically states that for everything that exists, there has to be a reason why it exists. And why it exists in the specific way that it does.
At first, that sounds pretty straightforward.
Right.
But I bet you could go down some pretty deep philosophical rabbit holes with that principle.
Oh, absolutely. The principle of sufficient reason has huge implications for debates about free will, determinism, the nature of God, even the structure of the universe itself.
Yeah.
I mean, if everything has to have a reason, does that mean there's no room for real freedom?
Mm-hmm.
Is everything already determined? These were questions that Wolff and his contemporaries really struggled with.
It sounds like Wolff was a major figure, but you mentioned that he had some pretty strong critics.
Yeah.
So tell me about the Pietists
Yeah.
and their conflict with his philosophy.
So the Pietists, people like Joachim Lange and August Hermann Frank, they were this religious movement.
Okay.
And they really emphasized personal experience of God
Okay.
over, dry theological doctrines. But they weren't just theologians sitting around thinking about stuff. They founded schools, they ran missions, they actively tried to shape society according to their beliefs.
So it sounds like a bit of a clash between a more intellectual, systematic approach to philosophy and a faith-based movement that was all about personal experience.
Exactly, and their conflict played out on multiple levels. One of the key points of disagreement was Wolff's idea of pre-established harmony.
Okay.
This is the idea that mind and body don't directly interact, but are perfectly synced up by God from the very beginning. Like two clocks that have been set to run in parallel.
I can see why that might raise some eyebrows.
Yeah.
It seems to downplay the role of human choice and free will,
Right.
maybe even a religious experience itself.
The Pietists definitely thought so.
Yeah.
They argued that this pre-established harmony thing really undermined the importance of the soul and the possibility of a real relationship with God.
Right.
They saw it as reducing humans to, like, automatons.
Yeah.
Just carrying out a script that was already written.
It's wild how these philosophical debates weren't just abstract arguments,
Yeah.
but actually touched on some really deep beliefs about what it means to be human and what reality is really all about.
Absolutely.
So did this conflict just stay in the world of ideas?
Not at all. The controversy got really heated. It even spilled over into politics.
Oh, wow.
Remember, Wolff was exiled from Prussia.
Right.
They threatened to hang him if he came back.
That's intense.
Yeah, it was this dramatic showdown that showed how philosophical ideas could have real-world consequences.
Wow. Exiled for his philosophical beliefs.
Yeah.
Talk about high stakes. So we've got Timasius challenging academic norms, radical philosophers questioning the very foundations of society,
Yeah.
and Wolff sparking controversy with his systematic approach to philosophy. It's already a pretty dynamic picture of 18th century German thought.
It is, and that's just the beginning. In the middle of all this intellectual ferment, you have this other really interesting figure, Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten.
Okay.
And he tries to bridge these seemingly opposing viewpoints.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's hear about Baumgarten and how he navigated this complex philosophical landscape.
Baumgarten was a student of the Pietists, but he was also a huge admirer of Wolff.
Okay.
So he was in this really unique position to try and bring these two seemingly opposite views together. He's probably best known as the father of aesthetics, which is a major contribution in itself.
Hold on, aesthetics.
Yeah.
I usually think about art and beauty when I hear that word, not the heavy philosophical stuff we've been talking about.
Right.
So how does that fit in?
That's what's so groundbreaking about Baumgarten.
Oh.
He argued that beauty and art could actually be the objects of like systematic philosophical inquiry, just like logic or
Yeah.
metaphysics. He actually coined the term aesthetics and pretty much created a whole new field of study.
So he's saying beauty isn't just like, subjective or emotional, but they're actual principles we can reason about. It's like he's elevating art to a whole other level.
Exactly. But his work goes even deeper than just art theory. Remember how Wolff was all about reason being the key to knowledge and ethics?
Right.
Well, Baumgarten gives a much more central role to the senses in how we understand the world. He wasn't rejecting reason outright, but he argued that our sensory experiences are really fundamental to how we grasp beauty, but also to how we form concepts and even make sense of reality.
Huh.
This is a thread that Kant picks up on later and develops in his own work.
It's interesting how Baumgarten is like a bridge between these different camps. He's got that influence from the pietists' focus on experience, but he also wants to keep that rigor and systematic thinking that Wolff brought to philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. And he's not afraid to tackle the big controversial stuff that divided Wolff and the pietists. Remember the whole debate about free will and whether Wolff's philosophy basically made humans sound like robots? Baumgarten offers this really nuanced perspective on how the will strives for perfection. He's trying to show that you can have both a rational pursuit of the good and the genuine freedom that the pietists were so worried about.
So it's like he's saying you could be intellectually rigorous and still acknowledge the complexities of being human.
Right.
But Baumgarten wasn't the only one trying to find some middle ground. There were other thinkers offering alternatives to Wolffianism. What about Christian August Crucius? He's mentioned in the Stanford Encyclopedia article as a pretty big critic.
Crucius is fascinating because he takes some of the pietists' concerns, but then he develops them into this really sophisticated philosophical system of his own. He really challenged Wolff, but not just from like a purely religious perspective.
Okay.
He argues that the principle of sufficient reason, the one that's so central to Wolff, can't actually explain everything.
That's a big claim. The principle of sufficient reason that everything must have a reason, it just seems so basic, like common sense. What's Crucius's argument against it?
For Crucius, the principle runs into trouble when you try to apply it to free will.
Okay.
If every choice we make is completely determined by prior causes, like the principle suggests, then are we really free? Crucius argues that true freedom actually requires that some things are not totally determined, that there's this real element of chance or randomness in the world.
So he's pushing back against this idea of a completely deterministic universe where everything is already set in stone. Yeah. And that has big implications for how we think about morality and responsibility.
Huge implications, absolutely. Crucius's philosophy is complex, but one way to understand him is that he's emphasizing the limits of reason. He even says that our minds operate according to certain principles. He calls it the essence of the understanding. And these principles actually shape what we can even think about, which means we might not have this direct access to absolute truth like Wolff seemed to believe.
So it's like our own minds are kind of putting blinders on us, limiting what we can know about the world. That almost sounds like something Kant would say.
You're picking up on a key theme here. These pre-Kantian thinkers were already wrestling with a lot of the questions that become super central to Kant's work later on. The nature of reason, the limits of knowledge, the role of the subject, all these things were being debated during this period. But what's really cool is that it wasn't just a debate between men. The Stanford Encyclopedia article talks about how women were also deeply involved in these discussions, even though they faced huge obstacles in the intellectual world at the time.
It's always awesome to hear about women breaking down barriers, especially in the 18th century. Tell me more about their contributions.
Oh, we could do a whole episode just on that, but let's focus on a few amazing figures. So there's Dorothea Christian Erxleben.
Okay.
She really embodies that spirit of practical philosophy we were talking about earlier. Inspired by Timasius, she went up against all these prejudices that prevented women from getting an education. She actually became the first woman to earn a medical doctorate in Germany.
Wow, that's incredible. It must have taken some serious determination to do that back then.
Totally. And it wasn't just individual achievements either. You have the two Sophies, Electra Sophie of Hanover, and her daughter, Queen Sophie Charlotte of Prussia. They weren't just patrons of Leibniz. They were actively involved in philosophical discussions and even contributed to his development of some key ideas. Their salons were like hubs for intellectual exchange. All the leading thinkers of the day were there, debating the big philosophical questions.
It's amazing to think of these women actually shaping the intellectual landscape like that. It really challenges the traditional idea of who gets to be a philosopher. Are there other examples?
Absolutely. You can't forget about Louise Adelgunde Victory-Gottsched.
Yeah.
She was this prolific translator. She made all these philosophical works accessible to a much wider German audience. Think about it. She played this crucial role in spreading these ideas, breaking down language barriers, and helping shape public discourse.
It's easy to forget how important translators are. They're the ones making knowledge accessible and spreading ideas across different cultures. Without them, a lot of these intellectual exchanges just wouldn't happen.
Exactly. And then there's Johanna Charlotte Unser. She wrote a philosophy textbook specifically for women.
Really?
Yeah. She breaks down all these complex ideas in a super clear, engaging way. She even uses poetry to illustrate some of the points. It's such a cool example of someone using their talents to make philosophy accessible to those who might have been excluded from the traditional academic world.
It's like she's taking these ideas that were usually just discussed in elite circles and saying, hey, these are for everyone. Everyone can think about these questions, no matter who they are or what their background is.
It's a powerful message, and it's one that's still relevant today. And speaking of expanding our idea of who gets to do philosophy, we can't leave out Anton Wilhelm Amo.
Anton Wilhelm Amo. That name sounds familiar. Remind me.
He was the first African-born professor of philosophy in Germany. Imagine the challenges he must have faced in the 18th century.
Yeah.
He studied and taught at prestigious universities, debated with thinkers like Descartes, and even contributed to discussions on the nature of the mind.
That's an extraordinary story. It says so much about his brilliance and perseverance, but it's also a reminder of all the injustices that have often silenced marginalized voices in the history of philosophy. We need to make sure these stories are part of the bigger picture.
Absolutely. Amo's story, like those of the women we talked about, enriches how we understand this period. It challenges us to question our assumptions about who gets to be a philosopher. It reminds us that the history of philosophy is way more diverse and complex than we might initially think.
It really drives home the point that these weren't just abstract debates happening in some vacuum. We're talking about real people with different backgrounds and experiences who were passionate about these ideas, and those ideas had a real impact on the world around them. Man, what a wild ride this has been. Exploring this, often forgotten era of philosophy.
Yeah.
I feel like we've just, barely scratched the surface of 18th century German thought.
I know, right? There's so much more to discover. But even from this little glimpse into these pre-Kantian thinkers, you can just see this incredibly rich mix of ideas, debates, and people who are really challenging the status quo. It makes you wonder, what are some of the things that connect all these different thinkers? Like, what are the common threads?
That's a great question. I think what really stands out to me is this constant back and forth between reason and experience.
Yeah.
Between trying to build these huge philosophical systems and admitting that there are limits to what we can know.
Yeah.
It's like they're wrestling with the same big questions that we're still trying to figure out today.
Exactly. Think about the whole clash between Wolff and the Pietists.
Right.
Wolff, with his system based on math and that principle of sufficient reason, he's like the poster child for this drive to have a complete, rational explanation for everything in the universe.
Right. Yeah.
But then the Pietists come in and say, hold on, what about personal experience? What about faith? What about free will? It's a debate that gets right to the core of what it means to be human.
And it wasn't just a theoretical debate either. Remember, Wolff got kicked out of Prussia for his ideas. These things had real consequences in the world.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And that tension between reason and experience, between trying to build these big systems and recognizing the limits of reason, it runs through pretty much all the thinkers we've talked about. Even Thomasius, who, flipped that correspondence theory of truth on its head, he's emphasizing the active role our minds play in how we understand reality.
It's like they're all trying to find this balance, right? Between this super rigorous philosophical approach to knowledge and acknowledging that we're not just brains in a jar. We're living, breathing people in a world that we experience through our senses, our emotions, all of that.
Exactly. And that's what makes someone like Baumgarten so interesting. He's trying to bridge those two worlds. He's showing us that we can have a really rigorous philosophical account of beauty and art without ignoring the importance of sensory experience.
Yeah.
He's like this key link between the rationalism of Wolff and that focus on experience and subjectivity that you'll see later on with thinkers like Kant.
It's cool to see how these ideas are kind of building on each other and influencing one another. And it's inspiring to see how women like Dorothea Christiane Erxleben, the two Sophies, Louise Gottsched, and Johanna Charlotte Unser were all making their voices heard in this intellectual world, even with all the limitations they faced.
Yeah, their contributions are so crucial to understanding how rich and complex this period really was. It reminds us that the history of philosophy isn't just this straight line of ideas. It's this dynamic conversation with all these different voices and perspectives.
And it really makes you think, like, how would we understand this era differently if those voices had been heard and appreciated more back then? What insights might we have missed out on?
That's a really good question, one we should keep asking ourselves as we keep studying philosophy. Whose voices are we paying attention to? Whose perspectives are we putting at the center? Are we really doing justice to the full range of intellectual contributions out there?
It's a reminder to be more inclusive in how we look at the past, to make sure we're recognizing the work of those who are marginalized or overlooked.
And not just in the past, but in the present, too. We need to be more aware of those voices today and make sure that everyone has a chance to be a part of these important conversations.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of pre-Kantian German philosophy, what's the one big takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they go about their day?
I hope they walk away with a sense of just how much intellectual energy and excitement there was in this period. It wasn't just a stepping stone to Kant. These were thinkers grappling with huge questions about reason, experience, what is real, what are the limits of our knowledge, where does moral authority come from. They challenged norms, pushed boundaries, and set the stage for some of the most important developments in Western thought.
It's a great reminder that even the most groundbreaking, revolutionary ideas don't just appear out of nowhere. They're built on the work of those who came before, the people who dared to question, to explore, and to offer new ways of seeing the world. And it's a challenge for us to keep doing that ourselves, to keep digging into these ideas and see how they connect to our own lives and our own understanding of everything.
Yeah, absolutely. The questions that these thinkers were wrestling with are still so relevant today. How do we balance the power of reason with what we know about the limits of our knowledge? What's the connection between our minds and the world around us? What does it even mean to live a good life? These are questions that every generation has to figure out for themselves.
And like we've seen, those conversations are always going to be richer and more insightful when we include a variety of voices and perspectives. So to our listeners, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep the conversation alive. Who knows what other amazing discoveries you might make along the way.